The booming housing market on Australia's east coast is great news if you are already an owner, but if you're not, there's a chance you may never be. Such is the dilemma posed by the steep rise in property prices in recent years. Today, the New South Wales Housing Minister, Rob Stokes, made an unexpected intervention, calling for changes to negative gearing, the tax breaks used by many investors to claim back their losses. Now, while the Prime Minister quickly ruled out any change, there are others who want the federal government to take another look at this difficult policy area. Until last year, the federal Liberal MP John Alexander was the chair of Parliament's Economics Committee, which was investigating the housing market. He joined me earlier. Well, John Alexander, the first question always these days on this area is the obvious one, and that is, what advice would you give to a young person who wants to buy a house in a capital city but doesn't have rich parents?
Well, unfortunately, the best advice would probably be to buy a lottery ticket, because I think you're just locked out of the market. And during our inquiry, I think the evidence was very strong to support that the investor who has been empowered, they're no longer negative gearers, and people don't quite understand this. As a negative gearer, you're restricted to how many properties you can buy because you've got to fund the losses. But with interest rates hovering around the same level as rental returns, you can be neutrally geared or positively geared, and so can buy more and more properties. And I think we've seen some people buy lots of properties. We've seen new entrants into the investment market with school teachers and nurses and people who may not be able to buy their own home, but they can neutrally gear or positively gear an investment property.
And it has now become virtually impossible for people trying to get in for the first time. The first home buyer doesn't really have many options, at least in the capital city markets.
Well, when you look at the price of houses in Sydney, the traditional economic basis is 3 to 5 years of average wages buys an average home. In Sydney, it's 12.2 years of average wages to buy an average home. So we're a long way off and accessible for housing to be accessible by a wage earner.
Now, you were looking at all of this on the House Economics Committee, but that inquiry report was basically shelved when the election happened. Should it be reinstated?
It should be reinstated, and it is going to be reinstated. So I understand that the Treasurer has written to David Coleman, who's the chair of the Economics Committee, to ask him to complete it. And I've spoken to David with the ideas that we'll work together on the final drafting.
So that has been revived, and that inquiry will be picked up where it was left off and continue?
Yeah, the evidence had been completed. It really is just a matter of drafting the evidence, drafting the recommendations, and then from that, which I think is a great way to develop policy for both sides, we'll have the evidence, we'll have the recommendations, and from that we each should consider this very deeply and then come up with a suite of policies to address the two critical issues: the volatility of the market, it's our biggest asset class, we don't want it to be volatile, and access to the market for this next generation of home buyers.
Is it likely that that inquiry would have recommended a change to negative gearing arrangements? Well,
one of the initial discussions when we were talking about doing this inquiry was, should we include addressing negative gearing? And that was included. So we will look at everything.
You have said in the past that what you think perhaps should be done is to incrementally adjust the rate of tax deductibility for new investors, and that would be a change to negative gearing, wouldn't it?
Yes, and I think this is where we depart enormously from Labor. If you were to get rid of negative gearing, that would crash the market. That would have devastating impact. What we've seen and had evidence is that APRA reduced lending to investors to 80%. So effectively, if you only borrow 80%, you can only deduct 80%. And that really, they did that for prudential reasons, to protect banks from an overheated market. But he said the happy side effect was that it cooled the investor down. So I think that's instructive. And then should we give consideration that if this works, why not look at being able to adjust that and calibrate that in line with any other market forces? If the RBA is going to move the interest rate, that's going to have an effect on the real estate market. Could we counterbalance that with this mechanism to have a stabilising effect on the market? And I think that's very important.
So the idea would be that you could only, if you're an investor, you could only claim a certain amount of the losses on your property? How would it actually work?
how it works currently, you can only borrow 80% of the value of a property, and so therefore you can only deduct that amount that you have borrowed. So effectively, at the moment, you can only deduct 80%.
Why is the Prime Minister so staunchly opposed to any change to negative gearing, and are you happy with that response from him?
In discussions I've had, they've been very open. He's very enthusiastic to look at the evidence and to build a great suite of policies in this area.
But he said today that he has no plans to consider changing negative gearing.
Well, we do have plans to look at the evidence and then to make decisions at that point in a deeply considered way. But I think the real lesson is that whatever is done, it must be done in small increments. It's a volatile market, and we must do everything we can not to destabilise that.
So then, Rob Stokes' comments today that there do need to be changes to negative gearing, are you at least encouraged that someone in the Liberal Party is prepared to speak out and say that?
Yes, I think the discussion needs to happen. It needs to be a contest of ideas. I think I've presented quite a few ideas that have been built into proposed policy. That might be a starting point, and from that starting point we can only move forward.
You did mention the changes that have been made in which the banks are less willing to lend, for example, to foreign investors now. They won't lend above 80%.
That's to all investors.
You're right,
Yeah.
but do you still believe that there are too many investors in the market?
Yes. Yeah. Look, ideally, the negative gearer provides affordable rental accommodation for those who can't buy. But the evidence, in my mind, was very clear that the investor, the negative gearer, or the positive gearer now, was actually stealing the opportunity of the home buyer to buy their first home.
All right. John Alexander, thanks very much.
Thank you.